In the spring of 1893, two lumberjacks named Carl Olson and Henry Lindgren stood at the base of a redwood tree in Humboldt County, California. The tree was 380 feet tall. It was 22 feet across at the stump. It had been alive when Christopher Columbus was still a child, growing quietly in the fog while empires rose and collapsed on the other side of the world. They had between them a 1-2-foot crosscut saw, 2 double-bit axes, 3 iron wedges, and a tin lunch pail. They had no chainsaw, no machinery of any kind, no engine, no electricity. Nothing that burned fuel. It took them 4 days to bring that tree down. When it finally fell, the ground shook hard enough that men in a logging camp 2 miles away said they thought it was an earthquake. The trunk hit the forest floor and split open in places, sending bark flying like shrapnel. The tree weighed an estimated 750,000 pounds. It produced 480,000 board feet of lumber, enough to frame 30 houses. Carl and Henry got paid $4 between them for the 4 days of work. $1 per man, per day. That was the standard rate in Humboldt County. I have been reading the felling logs of the Humboldt Bay Redwood Company, and what men did to these trees in the 1890s should not have been physically possible with hand tools. The physics of it doesn't make sense when you look at it on paper. A 1-2 foot saw blade and 2 exhausted Scandinavians against a tree trunk wider than a 2-lane road. But the photographs prove it. The company records prove it. The stumps that are still standing in the forest right now, more than 130 years later, prove it. This is how America felled 400-foot redwoods before chainsaws existed. To understand why men were cutting these trees, you need to understand what America was doing in the second half of the 19th century. The country was building, not slowly, not carefully. It was building with a hunger that consumed everything in its path. Railroads were pushing west at a rate of miles per day. Cities were doubling in population every decade. San Francisco went from a mudflat to a metropolis in 20 years, and every single building in it needed lumber. Redwood was not just any lumber. The California Redwood Association called it nature's masterpiece. And for once, the advertising wasn't lying. Old-growth coast redwood was resistant to rot, resistant to insects, resistant to fire. It didn't warp, it didn't split easily. The grain ran straight and true for dozens of feet without a single knot. The heartwood was saturated with tannin, a natural chemical that repelled termites and beetles so effectively that you could bury a redwood post underground and dig it up 20 years later and it would still be sound. You could build a water tank out of it and it would hold water for half a century without leaking a drop. The wood was also among the softest of the commercial conifers, which meant it was easy to mill, easy to plane, easy to nail. A carpenter could work with redwood all day and not dull his tools the way Douglas fir or white oak would. The lumber companies marketed redwood to the East Coast, to Hawaii, and as far away as Tahiti. They called it wonderwood, shrink-proof, warp-proof, split-proof, bug-proof, rot-proof, waterproof. They were exaggerating, but only slightly. And the demand was bottomless. Railroad ties, building beams, water tanks, fence posts, shingles, siding, coffins, cigar boxes, grape stakes for the vineyards spreading across Napa and Sonoma, cooling towers for the power plants going up in the Central Valley, flumes for the hydraulic mining operations in the Sierra Nevada, everything. If it needed wood that could take abuse and last, redwood was the answer, and there was an almost unimaginable amount of it standing on the Northern California coast. Before 1850, coast redwood forests covered more than 2 million acres, stretching in a narrow belt from Big Sur all the way to the Oregon border. Some of these trees were over 350 feet tall. Some had been growing for over 2,000 years. They were the tallest living things on Earth, and they had been the tallest living things on Earth for longer than any civilization had existed. The bark alone could be a foot thick, soaked with tannin that kept the bugs out and the fire from taking hold. The forest floor beneath them was dark and quiet, carpeted with ferns and the soft, decomposing bodies of trees that had fallen centuries ago. When gold was discovered in Northern California in 1850, thousands of men poured into the redwood region looking for ore. Most of them didn't find it. What they found instead were trees so large that the human mind had difficulty processing them. A single tree could contain enough lumber to fill an entire schooner. and the schooners were already waiting in Humboldt Bay. By 1853, 9 sawmills were running in Eureka alone. The industry wasn't growing, it was detonating. Companies like the Humboldt Bay Redwood Company, the Pacific Lumber Company, and the Dolbeer and Carson Lumber Company were buying up land as fast as they could survey it. Some of it they bought honestly. Much of it they took through fraud, transferring thousands of acres of prime redwood forest from public land to private ownership through schemes so brazen that even the federal government occasionally noticed. But the lumber kept flowing, and nobody wanted to stop the money. The men who actually cut the trees were not the men who got rich from them. They were Scandinavian immigrants, mostly. Swedes, Norwegians, Finns, and Danes who had come to America with nothing and were willing to do the most dangerous manual labor on the continent for $1 a day. There were also Portuguese, Italians, and a few Germans. They lived in camps in the forest, sleeping in bunkhouses that were essentially long sheds built from rough-sawn redwood planks, with bunks stacked 3 high along both walls and a cast-iron stove in the middle that never quite dried out the air. The bunkhouses smelled of sweat and wet wool and kerosene and tobacco smoke and the sharp mineral tang of the iron stove. In the winter, condensation dripped from the ceiling onto the men's faces while they slept. They ate in a cookhouse, elbow to elbow on long benches, served by a cook who was often the second most important person in camp after the filer. A good cook kept the men fed and relatively content. A bad cook caused desertions. The standard fare was salt, pork, and beans and sourdough bread, with occasional fresh beef when an ox was slaughtered, and dried fruit when the supply wagons could get through the mud. Coffee was constant and strong enough to dissolve a nail. The men ate in near silence. It was camp etiquette. You didn't talk at the table, you ate, you left, you went to work. They walked into the forest at dawn 6 days a week to do battle with trees that were older than their home countries. The first problem with cutting a redwood was getting to a place on the trunk where you could actually start cutting. The base of a large old-growth redwood flares outward in massive root buttresses that can extend 10 or 15 feet up the trunk. The wood in these buttresses is twisted, gnarled, and often so hard that it would ruin a saw blade in minutes. Cutting at ground level was a waste of time and steel. The solution was the springboard. A logger would take a double-bit axe and chop a notch into the trunk, usually about 8 to 12 feet above the ground, sometimes higher. The notch was cut at a slight downward angle, just deep enough and wide enough to accept the end of a heavy plank, about 5 feet long and 6 inches wide, with a steel tip on the end that bit into the wood. This plank was the springboard. The logger would jam it into the notch, step up onto it, and stand there 8 or 10 feet off the ground, balancing on a board that was 5 inches wide, with nothing between him and the forest floor except air. If you have never stood on a narrow plank jammed into the side of a tree, let me tell you what it feels like. It bounces, it flexes, it creaks. When you swing an axe or pull a saw on a springboard, the board moves with you. Your legs absorb the shock, and your balance depends entirely on a piece of iron biting into softwood and the angle of a notch you cut yourself. If the notch was too shallow, the board could slip out. If the wood was rotten, the notch could crumble. If you lost your footing, you fell backward onto whatever was below you, which was usually stumps, branches, and other debris that could break your back or your skull. On the largest trees, loggers would stack 2 sets of springboards. They would stand on the first set, chop a new set of notches higher up, jam in a second set of boards, and climb up to those. Sometimes 3 sets. Imagine it. 3 men, standing on planks driven into the side of a tree, 20 feet above the ground, swinging axes with a precision that had to be perfect because a missed stroke could split the board beneath their feet. There are photographs of this in the Humboldt State University Special Collections that look like they were staged for a circus act. They weren't staged. That was a Tuesday. Once the loggers were positioned on their springboards at the right height, the real work began. First, they had to strip the bark. Redwood bark can be up to 12 inches thick, and it is soft, stringy, and fibrous. It gums up a saw blade almost immediately, so the bark had to be chopped away with axes in a band around the entire circumference of the tree at the cutting height. On a tree 22 feet across, that is nearly 70 feet of bark to remove. Just stripping the bark could take half a day. Then came the undercut. The undercut, also called the face cut, was a wedge-shaped notch chopped into the side of the tree facing the direction you wanted it to fall. Two loggers working from opposite springboards would swing their axes in alternating rhythm, one striking while the other pulled back, chips flying with every blow. The undercut had to be precise. If the angle was wrong, the tree would fall in the wrong direction, and a 750,000-pound redwood fall the wrong way could kill every man within 100 yards. They used a tool called a gun stick, which was essentially a long stick with an angle gauge on it to measure the depth and direction of the undercut. It had to be exactly right. There was no margin for error. The undercut typically went about 1/3 of the way through the trunk. On a 2-2-foot tree, that means chopping a wedge roughly 7 feet deep into solid wood. Think about what that means in physical terms. Two men standing on bouncing planks, swinging 7-pound axes over and over, driving them into wood that is soft by timber standards but still wood, still heavy and resistant, for hours. Their shoulders burned, their hands blistered through their gloves, the sweat ran into their eyes and froze on the coldest mornings, and they hadn't even touched the saw yet. The crosscut saw was where the real endurance began. For the California Redwoods, they used saws that were 12 feet long. Some were even longer. When a 1-2-foot saw wasn't enough, two shorter saws were sometimes brazed together to make one continuous blade up to 16 feet in length. The saw blade was about 6 inches wide, made of flexible steel that could bend without snapping. It had teeth cut in a pattern called the Great American Tooth, with cutting teeth alternating with raker teeth that cleared the sawdust from the kerf. The whole blade, handle to handle, weighed between 30 and 40 pounds. Two men worked the crosscut, one on each end. They stood on springboards on opposite sides of the tree, and they pulled. You never pushed a crosscut saw. You pulled it toward you, and then your partner pulled it back. Push, and you buckle the blade. Push, and the teeth jam. Push, and the saw binds in the kerf, and you have to drive wedges in behind it to free it. Pull, pull, pull. That was the rhythm. Smooth, steady, endless pulling. A skilled two-man saw team could pull the blade through about 2 inches of wood per stroke. On a 2-2-foot tree, after accounting for the 7-foot undercut, they had roughly 15 feet of solid wood to saw through. At 2 inches per stroke, that is about 90 strokes per foot, roughly 1,350 strokes to complete the cut. And each stroke was a full-body effort, the kind of work that burns through 5,000 or 6,000 calories a day. They couldn't do it in one session. Nobody could. After a few hours of sawing, the muscles in your arms and back simply stop responding. The lactic acid builds until your forearms feel like they are full of concrete. Your grip fails. Your vision blurs from the sweat. The loggers would saw for a while, rest, eat from their tin pails, cold beans and bread, and sometimes a piece of dried beef. And then they went back to the saw. They drove iron wedges into the kerf behind the saw blade to keep the cut from closing on the blade as the tree's weight shifted. The wedges were struck with a sledgehammer, and the sound of iron hitting iron echoed through the canyon like a bell. They poured kerosene on the blade to keep it lubricated and prevent the pitch from gumming up the teeth. The kerosene mixed with the sawdust and the pitch and ran down the blade in dark rivulets that stained the loggers' hands black. Every evening, when the light faded and the fog came in, they stopped, drove their wedges in deep to hold the cut open overnight, cleaned the saw blade with an axe stone, and climbed down from the springboards. They walked back to camp in the dark. In the morning, before the sun was fully up, they climbed back onto those springboards and started again. On a tree like the one Carl Olson and Henry Lindgren cut in 1893, this process took 4 days. 4 days of climbing onto springboards at dawn. 4 days of pulling a 1-2-foot saw back and forth through wood that had been growing since the Roman Empire. 4 days of driving wedges and pouring kerosene and eating cold lunches on a plank 10 feet off the ground. 4 days of listening to the tree creak and groan as the cut deepened and the trunk began to shift almost imperceptibly on its base. On the morning of the 4th day, the sounds changed. The creaking got louder. The wedges were harder to drive because the wood was under compression now. The tree was no longer just standing there. It was leaning microscopically toward the undercut, and every stroke of the saw was releasing tension that had been holding this column of wood upright for centuries. And then came the moment. There was a sound that the old loggers described as a pistol shot. A crack. Not a creak, but a sharp, violent snap that echoed through the canyon. That was the sound of the last hinge of wood giving way. The loggers shouted the warning. In Humboldt County, the call was timber. But sometimes it was just, she's going. Or simply a wordless scream that meant, get clear, because 750,000 pounds of wood was about to fall and the ground itself was about to move. The tree fell slowly at first. Impossibly slowly, given its weight. The top swayed, then it tilted. Then it moved through the canopy, snapping the branches of smaller trees like matchsticks, and then gravity took over, and the speed increased with a rushing roar that the loggers said sounded like a locomotive bearing down on you. The air itself seemed to compress. Birds exploded out of the canopy in every direction. When the trunk hit the ground, the impact could be felt for miles. Literally, miles. Men 2 miles away at the logging camp reported feeling the ground shake and hearing a deep percussive boom that rolled through the canyon like distant thunder. The trunk shattered in places on impact, sending slabs of wood as big as wagons flying through the air. Sometimes the impact dug a trench in the earth 3 or 4 feet deep, the soft forest floor compressed and torn by the force. Sometimes the trunk bounced. An 80-ton tree bouncing off the ground like a dropped hammer. The first time you see it happen, you don't believe what your eyes are telling you. That was the most dangerous moment. Not the cutting, the falling. A tree that size pushes a wall of air ahead of it that can knock a man off his feet at 50 yards. The branches that break off during the fall are called widowmakers, and they earn the name honestly. A broken branch from a redwood can weigh several hundred pounds and travel at lethal speed in any direction. The trunk itself can kick backward off the stump when it falls, a phenomenon called kickback that has killed more loggers than almost any other hazard in the woods. In the summer of 1896, a logger named Nels Anderson was killed at the Pacific Lumber Company operation near Scotia when a redwood he was helping fell kicked backward off the stump and caught him across the chest. He was 34 years old. He had a wife in Eureka and 2 children under the age of 6. His body was brought out of the woods on a mule because there was no road wide enough for a wagon. In that same year, a man named Thomas Erickson, 28 years old, was killed by a widowmaker, a branch that fell from a neighboring tree, shaken loose by the impact of the redwood hitting the ground. The branch struck him on the head while he was standing what he thought was a safe distance away. There was no safe distance. Not really. A chopper named Olaf Henriksen fell from a springboard in the winter of 1899 near Freshwater Creek. The board slipped from the notch after a heavy rain softened the wood. He fell 12 feet and landed on a broken stump that punctured his lower back. He lived, but he never worked in the woods again. He was 31. The logging camps kept records, and the records are full of these deaths. Crushed by falling limbs, struck by kickback, fell from springboards, caught beneath rolling logs during the bucking, scalded by boiler explosions on the donkey engines, drowned in the rivers during the log drives. For every man who died, there were dozens more who were injured. Broken arms, crushed hands, severed fingers, shattered legs. The nearest doctor was often a full day's ride away on horseback, and the ride itself could kill a badly injured man. Loggers set their own broken bones with splints made from redwood bark. They packed wounds with pine pitch and strips of cloth torn from their shirts. They went back to work because there was no workers' compensation, no disability insurance, no safety net of any kind. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. And there was always another man, another Swede or Norwegian fresh off the boat in San Francisco, willing to take your springboard for $1 a day. After the tree was on the ground, the work of bucking began. Bucking is the process of cutting the felled trunk into manageable lengths, usually 12 to 16 feet, that could be moved to the mill. On a tree that produced 480,000 board feet of lumber, this meant making dozens of crosscuts through a trunk that was still 8 or 10 feet in diameter, even 100 feet from the stump. Each cut required the same kind of cross-cut saw work that felled the tree, just horizontal instead of vertical. Teams of buckers would work their way along the fallen trunk for days, sectioning it like a surgeon sectioning a body on a table. The bucking was dangerous in ways that were different from the felling. A felled redwood doesn't just lie flat on the ground, it rests on its own branches and on the uneven terrain, which means sections of the trunk are under tremendous compression and tension. When a bucker's saw cut through to the wrong point, the log could snap shut on the blade, trapping it. Worse, the trunk could split violently along its length, sending slabs of wood flying sideways. A slab of redwood 4 feet wide and 8 inches thick, launched by the sudden release of stored tension, could cut a man in half. The buckers learned to read the stress in the wood, to look for the way the trunk bowed and sagged, and to make relief cuts before the final cuts. It was a science built entirely from painful experience and dead men's mistakes. Once the sections were cut, they had to be moved. This was the most physically brutal phase of the entire operation. A single 1/6-foot section of redwood trunk, 8 feet in diameter, could weigh 20,000 pounds or more. You cannot move 20,000 pounds by wishing it somewhere else. Moving the cut sections was a feat of brute engineering. In the earliest days, the logs were dragged to the mills by teams of oxen, sometimes 8 or 10 yoke, pulling a single log along a skid road. Skid roads were paths cut through the forest with half-buried logs laid crosswise, greased with dogfish oil so the timber sections would slide over them. A man called a greaser walked ahead of the ox team, slopping oil onto the skids with a swab made from burlap sacking. The smell was extraordinary. Dogfish oil and redwood pitch and ox sweat and mud, all of it mixed together in a fog-soaked forest where the light barely reached the ground. The greaser's job was considered the lowest in the camp, but it was essential. Without the grease, the friction would stop the logs dead, and the oxen would founder. The oxen themselves were remarkable animals. A good bull team could pull 15 or 20 tons over a greased skid road, but the work destroyed them. Their hooves split, their shoulders rubbed raw under the yoke. They went blind from the constant spray of mud and pitch. A bull that lasted 3 seasons in the redwood camps was considered long-lived. Most were slaughtered and eaten by the crews when they could no longer pull. In 1882, a Eureka blacksmith named John Dolbear changed everything with his invention of the steam donkey. The steam donkey was a small, portable steam engine mounted on a sled with a drum of heavy cable attached. The cable could be strung through the forest and attached to a log, and the engine would winch the log back along the cable to the landing. It was loud and dangerous and prone to boiler explosions, but it could move timber that no team of oxen could budge. Dolbear patented his engine, and it spread through every logging operation on the Northern California coast within a decade. The sound of the donkey engine, that chugging, hissing, cable-screaming sound, became the soundtrack of the redwood forest for the next 40 years. But even with donkey engines for hauling, the cutting itself remained handwork through the 1890s and into the early 1900s. 2 men, 1 saw. That was the technology. The felling teams were the aristocracy of the logging camp. They were the highest paid, the most skilled, and the most likely to die. A good felling team worked together for years, developing a rhythm on the crosscut saw that was almost musical. The old-timers said you could tell a good team by the sound of the saw. A bad team made a grinding, stuttering noise. A good team made the saw sing, a steady, rhythmic hum that rose and fell as the blade moved through the wood. The Forest Service called their crosscut manual Saws That Sing. That wasn't poetry. That was literal description. Behind every felling team stood a man who is even more forgotten than they are, the saw filer. The filer was the most important man in the camp who never touched a tree. His job was to maintain the crosscut saws, and if he did his job poorly, the filers worked twice as hard and the company lost money. Filing a crosscut saw was a precise and exacting craft. Each cutting tooth had to be filed to the same angle, the same height, the same sharpness. The raker teeth, the ones that clean the sawdust from the kerf, had to be set to exactly the right depth, usually about 12 thousandths of an inch below the cutting teeth. Too deep, and the saw grabbed and bucked. Too shallow, and the sawdust packed the kerf and the blade bound. A good filer could feel the difference between a properly set saw and a bad one by running his thumb across the teeth. He worked by lantern light in a shed at the edge of camp, hunched over a saw vise, his files worn to nubs. A poorly filed saw was called a misery whip, and the name tells you everything about what it felt like to pull one through 22 feet of redwood. The pace of the cutting was staggering. At the peak of the redwood harvest, between 1,880 and 1,920, Companies were felling old-growth trees faster than anyone bothered to count. The Humboldt Bay Redwood Company alone operated multiple felling teams across tens of thousands of acres. The Pacific Lumber Company held 200,000 acres of prime redwood forest. Every day, trees that had been growing since before the Magna Carta was signed were falling to crosscut saws and being dragged to the mills on cables. The mills ran from dawn until dark, and in the busiest seasons, they ran through the night under electric arc lights, the saws screaming and the green lumber stacking up in yards that stretched for acres. And nobody was planting replacements. Why would they? There were 2 million acres of redwood forest. It seemed infinite. The loggers called it green gold, and like actual gold, they mined it until it was gone. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire accelerated the destruction. When the city burned, the demand for lumber exploded overnight. Entire hillsides of old-growth redwood were stripped bare to rebuild San Francisco. The schooners couldn't sail fast enough to keep up with the orders. Mill towns along the coast ran their saws 24 hours a day, cutting lumber by lantern light. By the time people started paying serious attention to what was being lost, most of it was already gone. The Save the Redwoods League was founded in 1918, and they began buying land and pushing for state parks. Humboldt State Redwood Park was dedicated in 1921. Prairie Creek, Del Norte Coast, and Jedediah Smith Redwood State Parks followed in the decades after. Redwood National Park was established in 1968, but by then nearly 90% of the original old growth had been cut. Today, only 5% of the original old-growth coast redwood forest remains. Out of 2 million acres, roughly 120,000 acres of ancient forest still stand. Everything else was converted to lumber, to houses, to railroad ties, to water tanks, to the physical infrastructure of a nation that was building itself as fast as it possibly could. The chainsaws finally arrived in the late 1920s and early 1930s. The first models were massive, two-man machines that weighed over 100 pounds and required their own support frame. They were loud, unreliable, and prone to throwing their chains. But even those primitive chainsaws could fell a tree in 90 minutes that had taken Carl Olson and Henry Lindgren 4 days with a crosscut saw. By the 1940s, single-operator chainsaws were standard equipment in every logging operation on the Pacific coast. The crosscut saw was hung on the wall of the bunkhouse and never taken down again. The transition happened so fast that the old skills simply vanished. The art of filing a crosscut saw, setting the raker teeth to the right depth, keeping the blade true and the kerf clean, those were skills that took years to learn and a lifetime to master. The Forest Service estimates that there are fewer than 100 people in the United States today who can properly file and maintain a two-man crosscut saw. The men who could balance on a springboard while pulling a 1-2 foot saw through 22 feet of ancient wood are all dead. Their knowledge died with them. You can still find the stumps, though. If you walk through the second-growth forests of Humboldt County, through the young redwoods that sprouted from the roots of the trees that were cut, you will come across them. The old stumps. They are enormous, 20 feet across, sometimes more. The wood is still sound because redwood resists rot, and these stumps will be there for centuries yet. Some of them still have the springboard notches cut into their sides, rectangular slots in the wood where a man once stood on a plank and swung an axe. If you put your hand inside one of those notches, you can feel the axe marks. Individual cuts made by a specific man on a specific day more than a century ago. The tops of the stumps are often flat and smooth, polished by a century of rain, and you can see the saw marks, the kerf line, the path that a 1-2 foot crosscut blade traveled through the wood, pulled by two men whose names appear in a company ledger and nowhere else. Carl Olson is a name in a felling log. Henry Lindgren is a number on a payroll sheet. $1. 1 day. One tree that took 4 days and weighed 750,000 pounds and had been alive for 600 years. The trees that remain are protected now, mostly. 75% of the surviving old growth is in parks and reserves. You can drive through Humboldt and Del Norte counties on Highway 101 and pass through groves of old-growth redwoods that will stop your breath. They are as tall as they ever were, as quiet, as old. The fog still comes in from the Pacific and threads through their branches in the early morning, and the forest floor is still dark and soft and full of ferns and sword ferns and redwood sorrel, a clover-shaped plant that folds its leaves down at night. Standing among them, you can feel the weight of their silence. These are trees that were already ancient when the first Europeans arrived on the California coast. Some of them are over 2,000 years old. They were seedlings when Rome was a republic. The tallest known living coast redwood, a tree called Hyperion, stands 380 feet tall. Its exact location is kept secret to protect it from visitors who might damage its roots. 380 feet. The same height as the tree Carl Olson and Henry Lindgren cut down for $4. But for every tree that still stands, 19 were cut. That is the math. 5% remains. 95% was taken. Most of it between 1,850 and 1,920. Most of it by hand. Most of it by men who were paid $1 a day and were dead by 50. The photographs from the Humboldt State University Special Collections, taken by the Swedish photographer A.W. Eriksson in the 1880s through the 1920s, show these men as they were. They are small figures standing on springboards or sitting on stumps that dwarf them completely. Their faces are weathered and serious. Their clothes are filthy with pitch and sweat and redwood dust. Their tools are enormous relative to their bodies. In some photographs, a man stands inside the undercut of a tree with his arms spread, and the notch is wider than his wingspan. In others, a dozen men stand on the stump of a felled tree, the surface large enough to hold all of them with room to spare. They look like men who know exactly how dangerous their work is, and have made peace with it because the alternative is no work at all. The stump photographs are the ones that stay with me. The men standing on the fresh-cut surface of a tree that was alive an hour ago, a tree that had been alive for centuries before any of their grandfathers were born. There is something in those images that the camera captured without meaning to. The scale of what was being done, the smallness of the men doing it, and the absolute irreversibility of the act. Once the tree was down, it was down forever. No replanting would bring back a 380-foot, 600-year-old redwood. That tree was gone, and the men on the stump knew it, and they cut the next one anyway because they were being paid $1 a day and their families needed to eat. I think about Carl Olson and Henry Lindgren standing on their springboards at dawn on the first morning of that 4-day cut. They would have looked up at the tree, and the tree would have looked like it went on forever, the trunk narrowing as it rose into the canopy until the top disappeared in fog or branches or simply distance. They would have known, in the way that experienced loggers know, approximately how the tree would fall and approximately how long it would take. They had done it before, probably dozens of times. They would have taken their axes and begun chopping the undercut, the chips flying, the sound echoing through the canyon, and they would not have stopped until the light was gone. 4 days later, they would have watched that tree fall. They would have felt the ground shake. They would have heard the sound that the old loggers said they never forgot, the sound of something that enormous hitting the earth. And then they would have climbed down from their springboards, collected their tools, and walked to the next tree. There was always a next tree, until there wasn't. If you visit those forests today, if you stand in one of the remaining old-growth groves and put your hand on the bark of a coast redwood, you are touching something that was alive before Christianity existed. The bark is soft and fibrous under your palm. The tree is warm, even on a cold morning, because the bark insulates it so well. You can press your ear to the trunk and hear the wind moving through the canopy 300 feet above you. It sounds like the ocean, but slower. Those trees are still here because someone decided they were worth more standing than they were as lumber. That decision came too late for 95% of the forest. It came too late for the men who cut the trees, who are buried in small cemeteries in Eureka and Arcata and Scotia and Crescent City, their headstones weathered to blank stone in many cases, their names erased by time as completely as the forests they helped destroy. The stumps remain, 22 feet across, springboard notches still visible, saw marks still sharp in the grain. Evidence of what two men could do with a 1-2-foot crosscut saw and 4 days of work that paid $1 per day. We built a country with that wood. We should remember what it cost. If this is your first time watching, consider subscribing. I cover the forgotten labor that built America. The men, the machines, and the methods that most history books skip entirely. There is more to find here, and I think it matters.